Today we're going to talk about the Byzantine Empire, which is really just the Eastern Roman Empire. After the Eastern Roman Empire becomes its own thing and the Western Roman Empire completely collapses, as historians, we call it the Byzantine Empire, even though they still call themselves the Roman Empire. There's never really any change in their mind. We just designate it as something different because it's not in Rome and everybody speaks Greek. In 285 CE, the Roman Emperor Diocletian divided the empire in half. You had a Latin-speaking western half of the empire, where Rome actually was, and a Greek-speaking eastern half of the empire, where the capital was located at the former Greek colony of Byzantium. This little city of Byzantium was renamed Constantinople by Constantine. So Constantinople was now considered the, quote, new Rome. And by 395 CE, the Roman Empire began to lose control of its western provinces. And by 476, the western part of the empire has completely collapsed, leaving only the eastern half of the empire. So even though Rome isn't in the Eastern Roman Empire, they still called themselves Romanoi in Greek. In fact, a lot of Greek people still called themselves Roman and Greek all the way up until like the 1900s. So if you look at the map, you see how the empire was divided in half. Everything in red was the Western Roman Empire. Everything in orange was the Eastern Roman Empire. The capital of Constantinople was located right where Europe and Asia meet each other in the eastern part of the empire. This is probably one of the most geographically strategic places you could possibly put an empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. So if we zoom into this spot right here, you'll see that Constantinople sits at a choke point where they could control the trade in and out of the Black Sea. Strategically located to catch land trade as well as trade by sea. Okay, so 395 to 1453, the Byzantine Empire stands as the dominant Christian power. The Byzantine Empire falls just 40 years before Columbus set sail. So you could argue the Roman Empire didn't actually fall until just 40 years before Columbus. And most historians do agree the Byzantine Empire is a distinct political state from the Roman Empire with a different capital, a different language, and also the Byzantine Empire was a Christian empire for the duration of its existence. Roman political institutions like the Senate and the Roman law code, the 12 tables, continued in the Byzantine world. And like I said, culturally, the Byzantine Empire spoke Greek. If you look at the bottom left graphic, you can see how the most powerful city in Europe shifted from Rome to Constantinople. And yes, Constantinople is in Europe because it sits on the Europe side of the Bosphorus. So under Justinian, the Byzantines were able to conquer much of the Western lands. And though they wouldn't hold these for long, it just shows how big and powerful the, quote, Roman Empire still was. Justinian's reforms included the simplification and standardization of Roman law. This project produced a law code that regulated all aspects of Byzantine life for the next 900 years. And it's the foundation for law codes in Western Europe. Justinian also completed massive infrastructure projects that transformed Constantinople into a thriving metropolis. Justinian also saw the construction of the Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia means holy wisdom in Greek, a massive church that symbolized the partnership between church and state in the Byzantine Empire. That church is one of the bucket list goals I have to visit. It was a museum forever, and then it just recently became a mosque again with Turkey's new political movement, but anybody can still visit. It's one of the only places where you can see Arabic calligraphy right next to Christian mosaics. Not bad for a building that's 1,500 years old. Okay, Justinian was influenced and possibly controlled by his wife Theodora. Theodora was born into a humble family and had to have the law specifically changed to allow the emperor to marry her. It's controversial exactly what Theodora did before she was married to the emperor. Some sources straight up call her a prostitute. Some sources call her a burlesque dancer. Either way, she was probably involved in some type of sex work. Now, I'm not saying anything negative about this. I'm just making the point. This might be one of the biggest rags to riches story in history. So Theodora goes from the absolute lowest class you can be in Constantinople to marrying the emperor. And from what we can tell historically, she must have been a literal genius because she was the one that would meet with envoys. She helped to pass laws. She was part of the construction of these massive projects building the Hagia Sophia. And she also acted as the emperor's backbone during the Nika riot, which almost overthrew Justinian. Whenever Justinian was ready to abandon the city, Theodora urged him to stay and maintain order. Look at the graphic on the bottom left. You've probably seen some of those pieces of artwork. What that is called a mosaic. Mosaics are little bitty pieces of broken glass and broken gold that are then applied to a wall to look like an image. In my opinion, they're absolutely beautiful. It's some of the prettiest art that we have from Europe during the Middle Ages because in Western Europe, they really weren't doing much art. The pictures of the kings on coins are like stick people. Okay, here's a view of the Hippodrome in Constantinople. This is where the Nika riots took place. Justinian got everybody who was trying to protest and riot into the Hippodrome, saying that he was going to negotiate, and then he sent the army in and slaughtered everybody. Right behind the Hippodrome is the emperor's personal palace, and this box in the Hippodrome was the emperor's personal skybox. The Byzantines were absolutely obsessed with chariot racing. It was a humongous part of their culture. If we zoom out a little bit, here's what Constantinople looked like from afar. It was one of the hardest cities in the world to invade because at the end of the peninsula, you had these humongous walls. In this harbor, they were able to block off access with a giant chain that stretched from one side of the harbor to the other. And if they wanted to lock the harbor, all they had to do was, with a series of levers, pull the chain up and ships couldn't get in or out. It's amazing how you can block an entire harbor with a giant chain. And moving on, the Great Schism. So after Peter, Christianity in Europe was technically centered in Rome. There were 5 patriarchs across the Middle East, and in Europe, the patriarchs were like the main churches. So the only 2 remaining by this time were Constantinople and Rome. And as time moved, these 2 churches started to pretty much function differently, even though they technically claimed to still be the same church. Some of the biggest differences were the western half spoke Latin, they were controlled by the Pope, and they controlled a bunch of different territories that weren't unified. In the eastern half, they spoke Greek. They were under the Patriarch of Constantinople, and it was mostly just the Byzantine lands. And the biggest difference, though, is the Pope claimed to be a political leader himself, like the Pope had his own country, and Patriarch of Constantinople was under the Emperor. That's a humongous difference if you stop and think about it, because the Pope was claiming to be a political and a religious leader, while in the Byzantine Empire, they had a political leader and a religious leader separate. And technically, the political leader was over the religious leader. And as we'll see in the next unit, that was the opposite under the Pope. The Pope claimed to be above kings. And the biggest issue, though, was both the Pope and the Patriarch claimed to be the head of the entire religion of Christianity. All right, so in 751, tension grew between Rome and Constantinople when the Pope was facing an invasion from the Lombards. The Pope requested help from the Byzantine Emperor, which was refused. The Byzantine Empire pretty much left the Pope out vulnerable. Instead, the Pope turned to the Franks for help. The Franks were a Germanic tribe which recently converted to Christianity. Pope Leo III ended up crowning the Frankish leader Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor. This was directly meant to offend the Byzantine Emperor, who still called himself the Roman Emperor. So what the Pope did is when the Pope didn't get help from the Byzantine Empire, he straight up made another Roman Emperor out of a political leader in Charlemagne. This can also be considered the origin of the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, if you look, you'll see the territory Charlemagne controlled. It wasn't exactly the Western Roman Empire, but you can get an idea of how the Pope could claim that this man was a new Roman emperor. Charlemagne's empire collapses very quickly, and his lands will eventually become what is today France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland. So the official split doesn't actually happen until the 1000 CE, though. Arguments over church ritual, like the type of bread used for communion and clerical marriage, ruin relationships between the East and West. The dispute's actually a little bigger than you might think. The Catholic Church began outlawing their priests to be married, and the Byzantines thought that their priests should be married, and that was another big split. In 1054 CE, as the controversy culminated, both the Pope and the Patriarch officially excommunicated each other. This formally severed ties between the churches, leading to 2 independent churches like we have today, the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. Orthodox Church is still prominent in Greece and Russia today. All right, if you look at the map, everything in blue is Roman Catholic today, and everything in red is Eastern Orthodox. You can see how big this split from 1,000 years ago still plays out today. All right, so eventually the Byzantine Empire does fall. The Byzantine Empire experienced a very slow decline. The decline was due to decentralized leadership and attacks from Muslim powers. In 600s CE, the Muslim armies take Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Those are the other three cities that had patriarchs. Eventually, Seljuk armies also began attacking the entire eastern parts of the empire. So later in this class, we'll talk about how the Seljuk takeover of the Middle East is actually what sparked the Crusades. Latin crusaders from the Roman world launched a series of crusades to attack the Muslim rulers in Jerusalem. Originally, the Byzantines helped the Latins. They would allow them to pass through the Byzantine Empire peacefully. But this took a really strange turn. By 1204, in the events known as the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople was sacked and pillaged by Latin crusaders. This established a very short-lived Latin empire in the area. Despite removing Latin leadership after this, the Byzantine Empire never truly recovered from the Fourth Crusade. In some ways, this was the true beginning of the end for the Byzantine Empire. Again, the Fourth Crusade is crazy because the Crusades were meant to, quote, retake Muslim land in the Middle East. But in the Fourth Crusade, they ended up attacking and destroying the largest city in the Christian world. Talk about forgetting your mission. All right, for 200 years, the Byzantine Empire struggled with the loss of territory to the Ottoman Turks, civil war, and an outbreak of plague. By 1453, Constantinople finally falls to the Ottoman Empire. Constantinople was renamed Istanbul, and the Ottoman Empire grew into a regional power. The center for Christian Orthodoxy shifted to Moscow, away from Constantinople during this time as well. The Ottoman Empire will grow to be even larger than the Byzantine Empire was. It's actually one of the most impressive empires. And the Ottoman Empire is so lasting that we'll still be talking about it all the way up until the World War I unit. The Ottoman Empire was still standing whenever my great-grandfather was born. Let's put it that way.
Istanbul was Constantinople, now it's Istanbul, now Constantinople, been a long time gone. Constantinople, now it's Turkish delight on a moonlit night. Every gal in Constantinople lives in Istanbul, now Constantinople. So if you've a date in Constantinople, she'll be waiting in Istanbul. Even old New York was once New Amsterdam. Why they changed it, I can't say. People just liked it better that way. So take me back to Constantinople. No, you can't go back to Constantinople. Been a long time gone. Constantinople, why did Constantinople get the works? That's nobody's business but the Turks. Istanbul. Istanbul. Istanbul, even old New York was once New Amsterdam.